In 1896, a 16-year-old boy in Tamil Nadu was seized by the certainty that he was about to die. No illness, no injury, just the full physical conviction of the body stopping. And instead of fleeing from it, he lay down, turned toward it, and asked, "What exactly is about to die?" You know the self he was asking about, the version of yourself you perform without realizing you are performing, the identity that tightens when it is threatened, collapses when it is unseen, and needs, with a hunger you have learned to call confidence or self-respect, to be confirmed by the world outside it. You have been calling that structure yourself. You have been spending your life protecting it, and nobody ever asked you whether the thing you are protecting was ever you to begin with. By the end of this video, through what that boy found beneath his own personality, through a British psychoanalyst's clinical work with children who had to become someone else to be loved, and through a 3,000-year-old Sanskrit concept that named what you were carrying before your civilization existed, you will understand the difference between the cage and the prisoner. That understanding will not make the cage disappear, but it will be the first time you have seen it from the outside. What the boy found at the bottom of that direct investigation, beneath the fear and the name and the accumulated story of his life, was an awareness that did not die, could not die, had no edges and no story, and no need to be confirmed by anyone. It simply was, prior to everything he had ever called himself. He would later become known as Ramana Maharshi, and he would spend the next 54 years teaching from that single experience, asking one question of everyone who came to him, the question he had asked in that room. Not who are you in the sense of your name or your history. Who is the one asking? 3 questions. Hold them. Who built the self you call yourself? Why does it need so much protection? And what was there before it was built?
You were not born with an ego. You constructed one. This is not a metaphor or spiritual proposition. It is the clinical finding of one of the most significant object relations theorists in the history of developmental psychology. Donald Winnicott, working with infants and children in post-war Britain, arrived at a distinction that most of his contemporaries found uncomfortable and most people still do. He called it the distinction between the true self and the false self. And what he found was this: when a child's environment, the primary caregiver, the family system, the emotional atmosphere of the first years of life, is sufficiently attuned to the child's actual nature, the child develops a self that is rooted in genuine experience, in what Winnicott called the spontaneous gesture. But when the environment requires the child to adapt, to suppress the spontaneous gesture and produce instead the gesture that will be received, that will generate love, that will prevent abandonment or punishment, or the particular silence that a child's nervous system reads as danger, the child builds a false self, a performed identity, a structure whose entire purpose is to manage the relationship between the inner world and the outer one, to present to the environment what the environment requires, rather than what the child actually is. And here is what Winnicott observed with a precision that should stop you in your tracks. The false self is not experienced as false. The child who built a compliant, self-effacing identity to manage a volatile parent does not grow into an adult who thinks of themselves as compliant and self-effacing. They grow into an adult who thinks of themselves as considerate, as mature, as someone who simply prefers harmony and has always been this way. The architecture of the adaptation becomes invisible because it is inhabited from the inside. You cannot see the cage when you are the one who built it and furnished it and have been living in it long enough that its walls look like the horizon. The neuroscience corroborates this in a way that should make the weight of it physical. The default mode network, The brain system active during self-referential thought, during the construction and maintenance of the self-narrative, is not a passive recorder of who you are. It is an active constructor. It takes the raw material of experience and builds a coherent story, and crucially, it prioritizes coherence over accuracy. It will revise memories, filter perceptions, dismiss evidence, and generate confabulations, plausible fictions, to maintain the integrity of the story it has already committed to. The self you experience as continuous and consistent and simply you is a construction maintained by a system whose primary allegiance is not to truth, but to narrative stability. The brain is not showing you who you are. It is showing you the story it has been telling about who you are, edited for consistency since the first experiences that required you to adapt. Consider the specific shape of your ego's needs, the particular form of recognition it requires, the precise variety of threat that destabilizes it most efficiently, criticism from certain people, invisibility in certain rooms, the specific failure that triggers not just disappointment, but something that feels like annihilation. That precision is not random, it is diagnostic. The shape of the ego's wound tells you exactly what the environment required and when, and what it cost to give it. The child who needed to achieve in order to be loved builds an ego that cannot rest in the absence of achievement. The child who needed to be small to avoid punishment builds an ego that contracts preemptively in any room where expansion might be dangerous. The child who needed to be certain in order to be taken seriously builds an ego that experiences doubt not as information, but as threat. These are not personality traits. They are survival strategies that hardened into identity before you were old enough to know that survival strategies and identity were different things. You are not broken. You were adaptive. The cage was built for good reasons by a child who had no other tools in response to an environment that would not wait for you to develop them. The problem is not that the cage was built. The problem is that you forgot it was a cage and started calling it home. Western psychology took until the 20th century to name what you have just heard. It took a tradition on the other side of the world 3,000 years less.
3,000 years before Winnicott sat with British children in post-war consulting rooms, and 2,900 years before a neuroscientist mapped the default mode network, a tradition of philosophical and contemplative inquiry on the Indian subcontinent had already named, mapped, and prescribed the treatment for the exact mechanism both of them were describing. The Sanskrit term is ahamkara. It translates literally as I maker, and in the Vedantic and Samkhya systems that developed it, it refers not to the ego as a pathology, but as a function, the specific cognitive operation by which the mind takes the continuous stream of experience and stamps it with the label I. I did this. I felt this. I am this. I am the kind of person who does and feels and is these particular things and not those others. Ahamkara is not, in this tradition, a mistake. It is a necessity. You cannot navigate the world without a functional sense of self, without the capacity to distinguish your body from the environment, your intentions from the intentions of others, your history from someone else's. The Vedantic tradition is not advocating for the dissolution of selfhood in any sense that would make ordinary life impossible. What it is identifying, with a precision that 3 millennia of contemplative testing has not eroded, is the specific catastrophe that occurs when ahamkara is mistaken for atman, when the I-maker is confused with the self that exists prior to and independent of the making, when the cage is mistaken for the prisoner. The Bhagavad Gita composed somewhere between the 5th and 2nd centuries BCE, and still one of the most psychologically acute texts ever written, dramatizes this confusion in a scene of almost unbearable precision. Arjuna, the great warrior, stands on the battlefield of Kurukshetra with his bow in his hands, facing an army that includes his teachers, his cousins, men he has loved, and he cannot fight. Not because he is cowardly, Arjuna is constitutionally incapable of cowardice, but because his ahamkara has attached itself to his relationships, his roles, his identity as a member of a family and a tradition, and the prospect of acting against those attachments produces a paralysis so complete he drops his bow and sits down in the middle of the battlefield and tells Krishna he would rather die than continue. Krishna's response, which constitutes the entire philosophical content of the Gita, does not dispute the reality of Arjuna's grief. It diagnoses its source. You are not paralyzed by the battlefield, Krishna tells him. You are paralyzed by your identification with ahamkara, with the constructed self that has attached its existence to roles, relationships, and outcomes. You have confused the I-maker with the self. You have mistaken the cage for the prisoner. And from inside that confusion, every action feels like a threat to the self, because the ahamkara treats every challenge to its attachments as an existential attack. The Gita's prescription is not detachment in the cold or indifferent sense. It is the cultivation of the witness, the capacity to act fully in the world while remaining rooted in Atman rather than ahamkara, in the awareness prior to the story rather than the story itself. Not the destruction of the self, but the correct identification of it. And what Krishna was telling Arjuna on that battlefield, what Patanjali had systematized in the Yoga Sutras, what the entire Vedantic tradition had been building toward for 3,000 years, is what a 16-year-old boy in Tamil Nadu would discover spontaneously in 1896, alone in a room, by asking himself a single question.
Return to that room. Return to Venkataraman lying on the floor, holding the certainty of death, asking what exactly was about to die. The answer he found, the awareness with no edges and no story, prior to everything he had ever called himself, was not a mystical experience in the sense of something unusual or extraordinary arriving from outside. It was recognition. The discovery of something that had been there the entire time, behind the personality, behind the ego, behind the constructed identity that his environment and his history had built around it. The way a wall is built around a fire, and the fire, having lived inside the wall long enough, begins to think it is the wall. What Ramana Maharshi spent his life pointing toward, and what every person who sat with him and asked a question received back as a question rather than an answer, is the recognition that you are not the story you have been telling about yourself. You are the awareness in which the story is being told. You are not ahamkara, not the I-maker and the things it has made. You are the one who was there before the making began, who will be there when every particular construction has been seen through, who is, right now, in this moment, behind whatever reaction this sentence is generating in you, aware. This is the distinction Winnicott was pointing at when he described the true self, not a better personality, not a more authentic version of the constructed identity, but the spontaneous gesture that existed before the environment required its suppression, before the cage was built. The true self is not an achievement, it is a prior condition, and the work, whether you approach it through Winnicott's clinical method, or Patanjali's Viveka, or the question Ramana Maharshi asked of everyone who came to him, is not construction, but excavation, not building a better self,
but seeing through the one that was built under pressure. The ego was not your enemy. The cage was not built by your enemies. It was built by you, by a version of you that had no other tools, that was doing the most intelligent thing available to a mind of that age in an environment of that kind, that was solving a real problem with the only materials it had. Winnicott was careful about this. He did not pathologize the false self. He honored it as a developmental achievement. The child who built a compliant, self-effacing identity to survive a volatile environment was not failing. They were succeeding at the specific task the environment had set. The problem is only that the task changed, that the environment of childhood is not the environment of adulthood, that the cage that was built for one room does not fit the larger life, and that nobody came to tell you that the task had changed, that the emergency was over, that the adaptation had outlived the conditions that required it. You are not the personality you built under pressure. You are not the identity you have been defending. You are not the story the default mode network has been maintaining for coherence. You are not ahamkara, not the I maker, not the accumulation of what the I maker has made. You are what Ramana found in that room in 1896, what Krishna pointed to on the battlefield, what Winnicott glimpsed in the space behind the false self's performance and called simply the true self. The awareness that was there before the cage was built, that has been here the entire time, that does not need to be constructed because it was never destroyed. The cage is real, but you are not the cage. You are what was caged. You have not been living as yourself. You have been living as the answer to a question your childhood asked before you were old enough to choose your response. If something in this video named the cage you have been living inside, share it with one person who is still decorating theirs. Not for the channel, for them.